A young woman, alone on the snowy coast of Maine, her only companion, Max, a loyal golden canine once trained by her late father. The bills piled high, the debts grew heavier, and one offer came: live as the paid companion of Ethan Winchester, the cold, untouchable heir no one dared to love. 4 years later, she would walk away in the dead of night, and what happened next will break you, then put you back together. Before we start, tell me, who was the most loyal dog you ever knew? Drop their name in the comments. If you believe love can free even the most captive heart, hit subscribe. This story will stay with you long after it ends. Winter in Bar Harbor. Maine was a long, unyielding thing. The Atlantic wind carried the sharp scent of salt and iron, raking over the frozen harbor where fishing boats sat still, their hulls locked in sheets of ice. Snow lay in drifts against shuttered shop fronts, and the sky, low, bruised, and heavy, threatened another storm before nightfall. Out on the far edge of town, where the last paved road turned into a narrow track of frost-bitten gravel, stood a weather-worn cottage with peeling white paint and a roof sagging under weeks of snow. It was here that Savannah Miller lived, with her only companion, Max. Savannah was 20 years old, though the last few years had added a quiet gravity to her that made her seem older. She was of medium height, her build slender but wiry, the sort that came from years of making do and doing without. Her hair was chestnut brown, falling in loose waves to her shoulders, often tucked under a knitted beanie to shield her from the wind. Her skin was pale, touched with freckles that deepened in summer, but now seemed like faint ghost marks under the winter light. Her eyes, a muted green, often carried a faraway look, like she was listening to something no one else could hear. Life had taught her to be self-reliant, losing both parents in a car accident at 16, and spending the years after working odd jobs to keep herself afloat. Max was more than a dog. He was a 4-year-old golden shepherd, his coat a thick, gleaming gold with streaks of pale cream along his chest and tail. His father had been a German shepherd, his mother a golden retriever, and he'd inherited the sharp intelligence of one and the gentle loyalty of the other. Max had been her father's service dog during his final tour overseas, a canine trained for scent work and protection. And when her father died, Max had come to her like a living piece of the man she'd lost. His deep amber eyes followed her everywhere, and in the silence of winter nights, she swore he understood every word she spoke. The day had started like most others, Savannah awake before sunrise, stoking the wood stove with gloved hands, Max pressing his warm body against her leg, as if to remind her they were still here, still together. The old cottage creaked with every gust, and the smell of strong coffee filled the cramped kitchen. But today, there was an unfamiliar weight in the air, something more than the heaviness of snow. It came in the form of a knock at the door, sharp and deliberate. The man who stood on the porch looked as if winter couldn't touch him. Samuel Harris was in his 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face lined by both age and an ingrained sense of authority. His hair was silver, cut close to the scalp, and a neatly kept mustache framed a mouth that rarely smiled. His eyes were steel gray, the kind that seemed to see more than you wanted to reveal. Samuel had once been an attorney in Boston, but after representing the Winchester family for decades, he had become more than legal counsel. He was their trusted fixer. If the Winchesters wanted something, Samuel found a way to get it. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice carrying a formal precision, as if even his breath was bound by a contract. "I'm here on behalf of the Winchester family." Savannah's stomach tightened. The Winchesters were a name people in Bar Harbor spoke with both awe and resentment. Their wealth came from generations of shipping and real estate, their estate perched high on a cliff overlooking the sea, far removed from the modest lives of the townsfolk. Max stood beside her, his ears pricked forward, tail still but ready. Samuel's gaze flicked briefly to the dog before returning to Savannah. "You'll want to hear the proposal," he said, stepping inside without waiting for her invitation. At the kitchen table, Samuel laid out a leather portfolio, the smell of polished hide mingling with the scent of wood smoke. He spoke without hesitation, the words practiced. "Ethan Winchester, the only son of the family, has particular habits. He does not engage in personal relationships. This has been the case for years, by choice. However, the family believes a steady companion might benefit him. They are offering you a 1-year agreement, renewable annually, as his exclusive companion." Savannah blinked. "Exclusive companion?" "You would live on the estate," Samuel said, sliding a contract toward her. "Attend social events with him, travel if necessary, and be available when he requires company. You are not expected to marry. This is an arrangement purely personal, entirely compensated." Her fingers brushed the paper. $200,000 a year. She could pay off the mortgage her parents had left, fix the leaking roof, secure enough savings to keep Max fed and healthy for life. But the very wording, exclusive companion, felt like a velvet chain. Samuel's eyes softened, though his tone stayed measured. "The Winchesters know of your situation, your father's service record, the debt, and Max, of course." His gaze flicked again to the dog, now lying at Savannah's feet. "You'd be permitted to bring him. Ethan has no objection to animals on the property." That surprised her. Rich men in glass houses rarely wanted muddy paws on polished floors. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Samuel closed the portfolio with a quiet click. "Then, you refuse. But I suspect opportunities like this don't knock twice, Miss Miller." When he left, the cottage felt smaller somehow, the wind louder against the thin walls. Savannah sank into the chair, Max resting his head in her lap. She stroked the warm fur along his neck, her mind racing. She thought of the winter ahead, the heating bills, the vet fees for Max's recent hip injury. She thought of the way people in town had started looking at her, not unkindly, but with the silent awareness that she was running out of road. By late school afternoon, the sky had deepened to a violet gray. Snow began to fall in slow, deliberate flakes, coating the world in silence. Savannah lit the single lamp in the living room and opened the contract again. The legal language was dense, the terms precise: confidentiality, exclusivity, renewal options. Her pen hovered over the signature line. Max lifted his head, amber eyes fixed on her face. In that gaze, she saw her father's trust, his belief in her strength. She knew signing meant stepping into something she couldn't predict, maybe couldn't escape. But the alternative, staying here, waiting for the world to shrink further, felt like another kind of trap. Her name curved across the page in black ink. When she set the pen down, she told herself it was for Max, for the roof, the heat, the safety, for the life her father would have wanted her to have. But somewhere deep down, in a place she didn't like to acknowledge, there was curiosity about Ethan Winchester, about the man who had everything and still kept everyone away. Outside, the snow thickened, erasing the path to her door. Somewhere beyond that white curtain lay the estate on the cliff, and the man whose life she had just agreed to step into. She didn't know it yet, but this contract would be more than a winter arrangement. It would be the start of something that would test the limits of her loyalty, her freedom, and the quiet resilience she had built around herself. Max shifted, resting his paw on her knee as if to seal their unspoken pact. Wherever she went, he would follow, even into the unknown. 4 years can slip past like water under ice, slow on the surface, but with a current pulling fast beneath. For Savannah Miller, those years had been lived behind the high wrought-iron gates of the Winchester estate, in a house where every chandelier sparkled and every shadow seemed to hold its breath. Outwardly, she and Ethan Winchester were the picture of a couple, attending charity galas, arriving together at black tie events, sitting side by side at family dinners. But beneath the polished surface, she knew better. She was here because of a contract, and contracts, like winter, always came with an end date. The Winchester estate stood on a cliffside overlooking the restless Atlantic, its stone facade weathered but commanding, the kind of house built to outlast centuries. Inside, life was a clockwork machine, staff moving with quiet precision, voices hushed, and a sense of constant observation. Max had adapted to the grand halls and echoing staircases better than Savannah ever had. At 8 years old now, his golden coat had deepened in color, and faint silver showed around his muzzle, but his eyes still gleamed with the same alert warmth. The staff adored him, especially Clara, the head housekeeper. Clara Bennett was in her late 40s, with auburn hair streaked by early silver, worn in a tidy bun at the nape of her neck. Her build was tall and solid, her movements efficient, but not hurried. She had a kind face, lined at the corners from years of smiling, and a voice that could hush a room without raising in volume. Clara had been with the Winchesters for over 2 decades, long enough to remember Ethan as a boy. She treated Savannah with a polite reserve that never crossed into familiarity, but she had a soft spot for Max, often slipping him bits of roast chicken when she thought no one was watching. That winter afternoon, snow was falling in slow, fat flakes, dusting the wide terrace outside the library windows. Savannah had been in the sitting room reading, Max dozing at her feet, when a sudden thump echoed down the hallway. Max's head lifted, ears pricked, and before she could react, he trotted off in the direction of the sound, nails clicking against the polished oak floors. She followed, calling softly, "Max, leave it!" But the dog had already nudged open the door to Ethan's private study, a place Savannah rarely entered. The room smelled faintly of cedar and leather, with tall shelves lined in books, and the glow of a desk lamp casting warm light over papers stacked with precision. Max was standing near the far wall, his tail swaying gently beside a fallen photograph frame. Savannah bent to pick it up, brushing a bit of dust from the glass. The image inside was sharp and vivid. Ethan, younger by perhaps a decade, his dark hair a little longer, kneeling on one knee with a small velvet box in his hand. The diamond ring inside sparkled under what looked like late afternoon sunlight. Across from him, a woman stood with one hand to her mouth, her eyes wide in what could only be joy. The woman was striking, tall, with honey-blonde hair in soft waves, skin like porcelain, and eyes of an ice blue so clear it was almost unsettling. She wore a pale dress that seemed to belong to another season, maybe spring, and the wind in the picture teased the fabric against her legs. Her name was etched in neat script on the back of the photograph, Grace Ellington. Savannah's chest tightened. She had never seen Ethan look like that. Not in 4 years, not even when cameras flashed at galas. His expression in the photograph was stripped bare, open, almost reverent. "Ms. Miller?" Clara's voice came from the doorway, calm, but carrying an undercurrent of surprise. Savannah turned, the photo still in her hand. Clara's gaze flicked to the frame, then quickly back to Savannah's face. "That's from some years ago." "Who is she?" Savannah asked, though she already knew the name. Clara hesitated, a rare crack in her composed manner. "Grace. She and Mr. Winchester knew each other very well." Her tone suggested that was all she would say, and Savannah knew better than to push. When Clara left, Savannah replaced the photo carefully on the desk, straightening it so it matched the angle of the others. Max had settled beside her, resting his chin on her knee as if sensing her unease. She absently scratched behind his ears, her mind running through the years she had been here. Ethan's rules, Ethan's silences, Ethan's distance. She had always assumed he stayed away from emotional entanglements because that was simply who he was. But the photograph told another story, one in which he had once been willing to kneel, to offer, to love. That night she could hear the sound of the wind clawing at the windows, the sea below pounding against the cliff. Max lay at the foot of her bed, his breathing slow and steady. Savannah stared at the ceiling, the image of Ethan's face in that moment, eyes lifted toward Grace, burned into her mind. If he had once been willing to break his own rules for her, what would he do if she came back? And if Grace had returned into his life, where did that leave Savannah? The next morning, over coffee in the sunlit breakfast room, she watched Ethan from across the table. His dark hair was neatly combed, his jaw clean-shaven, the planes of his face set in that same unreadable calm. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that came from discipline, perhaps too much of it. He spoke little, his voice even and controlled, asking only about the day's schedule. Savannah answered, masking her thoughts, but every time his eyes met hers, she thought of the softness she'd seen in that photograph. When Ethan left for a business meeting in town, she took Max for a walk along the edge of the property. The path wound through wind-bent pines and ended at a low stone wall overlooking the churning sea. She stood there, the cold biting. Through her gloves, Max pressed against her leg for warmth. She realized then that she had begun counting days, not until the next event or the next season, but until the contract renewal date. Back at the house, she passed the closed study door and felt a faint pull, the kind that came from knowing something you weren't meant to know. The photograph had been a slip, an accident brought on by Max's curiosity, but it had opened a door in her mind she couldn't close again. That evening, when she fed Max and watched him curl into his bed in the corner of her room, she made herself a silent promise. She would not become so entangled in the golden cage of this life that she forgot it had a lock and that the key was still hers for now. For the first time in years, Savannah began to imagine life beyond the gates of the Winchester estate. And it all started with the look in Ethan's eyes for another woman. The winter storm that rolled in overnight left the estate wrapped in a blanket of white, so thick that even the tall iron gates seemed softened at the edges. From her bedroom window on the second floor, Savannah watched the groundskeepers, two bundled men with red cheeks and ice-stiff scarves, clear the stone walkways with shovels. Max stood beside her, tail gently swishing, fogging the glass with his breath. His collar, a worn leather band with a small brass tag, glinted in the pale light. That collar had been with him since the day her father brought him home. The tag still bore her father's neat block handwriting on the back. Property of Staff Sergeant Miller. The collar had become a kind of talisman for her over the years. In the early days at the estate, it was the only thing that felt solid and familiar. She remembered her first night there, Max curling on the rug beside her borrowed bed, the faint jingle of the brass tag each time he shifted. Ethan hadn't been there that night. He'd been away on business in New York. She had met him 3 days later. Ethan Winchester had been unexpected. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a kind of presence that filled a room before he spoke. He had eyes the color of dark oak, and a jawline that looked as if it had been cut from stone. His black hair was always immaculate. His suits fitted so precisely, they looked tailored to his posture. Yet there was no warmth in his expression when they first shook hands. Just a cool assessment, like a man evaluating a stock portfolio. It had stung, but Savannah had hidden her reaction. Oddly, it was Max who'd broken the ice. The dog had trotted straight to Ethan, sniffed his hand, and sat at his feet as if claiming him. For a fleeting moment, Ethan's mouth had softened into something like a smile. "Well trained," he'd said, scratching behind Max's ears. Savannah had caught the faint surprise in his tone, as if he hadn't expected loyalty to be freely given. In the years that followed, Max became a quiet bridge between them. On the rare weekends when Ethan stayed home, Savannah would find him in the garden throwing a tennis ball for Max, or taking him on the cliffside trail. Sometimes he'd talk to the dog in a low, steady voice, about business frustrations, about the weight of running the family empire. He never spoke that way to her. Still, she listened from a distance, grateful for those small cracks in his armor. But as months turned into years, the walls around Ethan seemed to grow taller. What had begun as a life of careful boundaries became one of invisible chains. Every outing Savannah took was cleared by his assistant. Every phone call she made was logged. Even her wardrobe was curated by a personal shopper named Lydia Marsh, a severe woman in her 30s with perfectly straight black hair, sharp cheekbones, and a voice that carried the crisp efficiency of someone who measured worth in results. Lydia was polite but impersonal, and Savannah often felt like a mannequin being dressed for display. Ethan's control extended beyond the social calendar. He had opinions on what Savannah read, what news channels played on the television, even the kind of coffee she drank in the mornings. He never raised his voice, but his disapproval was a quiet, suffocating thing. The only time she felt entirely herself was when she was with Max, walking him along the cliff, grooming his thick coat in the sunroom, or sitting on the kitchen floor with him on stormy nights. One evening in early spring, Savannah broached the subject that had been on her mind for weeks. Ethan was in the library, a glass of scotch in hand, the firelight casting sharp shadows across his face. Max was sprawled at his feet. She stood in the doorway, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "I've been thinking," she began, keeping her tone light. "When the contract ends this year, maybe it's time for me to—" Ethan didn't let her finish. He looked up slowly, the amber liquid in his glass catching the light. "The contract has renewal clauses, Savannah. You know that." "I do," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "But I also know it's not binding if— It's binding if I say it is." His voice was calm, but the steel in it made her chest tighten. "You've been given comfort, stability, and protection here. That doesn't change because you've grown restless." Max's head lifted at the shift in tone, his eyes moving between them. Ethan reached down, absently stroking the dog's neck, his fingers brushing the leather collar. "Besides," he added, "Max has grown attached to the grounds here. You wouldn't want to unsettle him, would you?" The implication landed like a stone in her stomach. He knew Max was her anchor, and he was willing to use that bond as leverage. That night Savannah lay awake, Max curled at her side, the brass tag of his collar pressing lightly against her hand. She thought of her father, how he had taught her that loyalty was earned, never taken. The quiet, constant companionship of Max was proof of that truth. She wondered what her father would say if he saw her now, in a gilded cage built of contracts and quiet control. In the morning, the storm had cleared, leaving the world outside gleaming under the winter sun. From the terrace, Savannah could see the ocean stretching to the horizon, its surface cold and glittering. Max stood beside her, the wind ruffling his fur. She tightened her grip on his collar, not to restrain him, but to remind herself that the choice to stay or to leave was still hers, if she dared to take it. It was a Sunday afternoon in late February when Grace Ellington walked back into the world Savannah had been living in for 4 years. The winter sun was thin, hanging low in the pale sky, and the estate gardens were still buried under crusted snow. Savannah had been in the solarium, trimming the dead leaves from a potted rosemary bush, when the sound of car tires on the gravel driveway drew her attention. A black sedan, sleek and dusted with frost, rolled to a stop at the front entrance. The driver, a tall man with dark skin and close-cropped hair under a chauffeur's cap, stepped out and opened the rear door. Grace emerged like a figure stepping out of a memory, tall, poised, her honey-blonde hair glinting in the light, the waves perfectly smoothed despite the wind. She wore a cream wool coat that cinched at the waist, leather gloves, and a silk scarf in a shade of deep sapphire that made her pale blue eyes almost unnatural in their brightness. Her skin was luminous, her makeup precise. There was nothing hurried in her movements. She walked up the steps as though she had never been away. Ethan was waiting at the door. He came down the steps to greet her, a rare break from his usual reserve. His dark suit contrasted sharply with the snow, and for the first time in years, Savannah saw his eyes soften in a way that made her chest tighten. He took Grace's gloved hand and pressed a kiss to her cheek, his free hand steadying her elbow as if she were something fragile. They stood close, speaking in low voices, before disappearing inside together. Over the next few days, Grace's presence wove itself into the rhythm of the house. She stayed in the East Wing guest suite, her laughter occasionally drifting down the hallways, her perfume, a light floral with a sharp undertone, lingering in the air after she passed. The staff adjusted to her as if it were the most natural thing. some even looking at her with the kind of deference they never showed Savannah. Clara, the head housekeeper, became more animated in her company, often bringing her tea or arranging fresh flowers in her rooms. Savannah told herself she didn't care, but the shift was undeniable. Ethan began canceling dinners with Savannah, opting instead for long conversations with Grace in the library or drives into town. He took her to the cliff path with Max in tow, though Max always seemed more inclined to trot back towards Savannah when given the chance. It was Max who found Grace crying. It happened one cold morning in the back garden, where patches of stubborn snow clung to the frozen earth between the hedges. Savannah had been in the kitchen, feeding Max, when he suddenly trotted toward the garden door, nose twitching. She followed him out, the air biting at her cheeks. Grace was sitting on a wrought-iron bench beneath the skeletal branches of a maple tree. Her gloves were off, her bare hands clasped together tightly in her lap, and her eyes, red-rimmed now, were fixed on the ground. Max approached her, tail low, ears forward, and let out a sharp, single bark. Grace startled, lifting her head. "Oh, Max," she said, her voice thick. She reached out to stroke his head, but he stayed still, watching her. Savannah was just stepping forward when Ethan appeared from around the hedge. "Grace," he said, crossing to her side in quick strides. "What happened?" His gaze flicked briefly to Savannah, then back to Grace. "Nothing," Grace murmured, shaking her head. "I'm fine." Savannah spoke without thinking. "She doesn't look fine." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Savannah, this isn't your concern." His tone was firm, edged with something colder than she expected. Max moved closer to Savannah's leg, but Ethan stepped subtly between them, his attention still fixed on Grace. "Go inside," he told Savannah, not raising his voice but making it clear it wasn't a suggestion. The walk back to the house felt longer than usual, the snow crunching too loudly under her boots. Max stayed close to her, glancing up as if reading her mood. In the kitchen she crouched to scratch behind his ears. "Good boy," she whispered, though the praise felt hollow. That evening, Savannah decided she'd had enough of watching from the sidelines. She found Ethan in the library, standing by the fire with a drink in hand. The room was warm but tense. "We need to talk," she said, stepping inside. Ethan didn't look up immediately. About Grace? About us?" Her voice wavered but didn't break. "You can't have it both ways, Ethan. If she's here to stay, then I'm not." His eyes lifted to hers at last, cool and unblinking. "You're suggesting I choose?" "Yes," she said. "Choose me or her." For a moment he studied her as if she were an unfamiliar document he needed to dissect. Then the corner of his mouth lifted, not in humor but in something dangerously close to disdain. "Savannah, you're here because we have an agreement. She's here because she doesn't need one." The words landed harder than she expected. She opened her mouth to reply, but he turned away, tossing back the last of his drink. "Don't make ultimatums you can't enforce," he said over his shoulder before walking out. Savannah stood there alone, the fire crackling in the grate, Max's brass collar faintly jingling as he entered the room and pressed himself against her leg. The snow had been falling since dusk, a relentless curtain of white that muted every sound and blurred the edges of the estate. By midnight, the world beyond the Winchester gates seemed to have vanished entirely, as though only this house and its inhabitants existed in some frozen, isolated realm. Savannah sat in the small armchair by her bedroom window, Max at her feet, listening to the wind pressing against the glass. It was near 1 a.m. when she heard hurried footsteps in the hallway. Rising, she cracked the door and saw Ethan striding toward the front of the house, already pulling on his heavy black overcoat. His hair was slightly mussed, his jaw unshaven from the day before. Behind him followed Lydia Marsh, his personal assistant, her posture sharp and her dark eyes narrowed in concentration. Lydia was a woman in her mid-30s, slim with angular features and a presence that always felt 2 degrees colder than the room she occupied. Her long black hair was pulled into a tight braid, not a strand out of place, and her tailored gray coat only emphasized her precision. She moved like someone used to cleaning up other people's messes, efficient, quiet, without emotional engagement. Ethan paused at the door just long enough to speak to Lydia. "Have the car warmed. We're going to the Ellington place. Grace is ill." "Yes, sir," Lydia replied, her voice low but brisk. She glanced toward Savannah's open door, her gaze assessing but unreadable, before disappearing toward the garage. Savannah stood still, her fingers curled around the doorframe. Ethan didn't look her way. He stepped into the night without a backward glance, the swirl of snow swallowing him whole. For a long moment she listened to the distant hum of the engine as the car pulled away. Then she turned back into her room, her pulse quickening. This was her chance. She moved with deliberate calm, pulling a small suitcase from the back of her closet. Into it went the essentials, 2 changes of warm clothes, her worn leather wallet, the folded photo of her parents she kept hidden in a book, and a tin of Max's favorite treats. She took his leash from the hook by the door, clipped it to his collar, and knelt to meet his eyes. "We're leaving, Max," she whispered. The golden dog's ears twitched, and he gave a small whine as if sensing the weight of her words. From the top drawer of her dresser, she pulled out the old coat Ethan had given her during their first winter together, a simple wool garment in dark navy with a lining of soft flannel. It had been one of the few gestures that felt uncalculated at the time. She remembered the day clearly, a bitter wind cutting through the gardens, her own thin jacket doing little against the cold, and Ethan, without a word, shrugging out of his coat and placing it around her shoulders. She had cherished it for years. Now she held it for a moment, fingers tracing the seams, before laying it neatly on the bed. She would not take it with her. Whatever kindness it once symbolized had long since been buried. Downstairs the house was silent. The staff quarters were dark, the ticking of the grandfather clock, the only sound. She led Max through the service corridor to the back door, where a narrow path led to the old gardener's gate. Rarely used in winter, its latch stiff with rust. The cold hit her like a wall the moment she stepped outside, the wind tearing at her scarf, snowflakes stinging her cheeks. Max pressed close to her leg as they crossed the garden. His fur was dusted white within seconds, his breath visible in short, quick bursts. She paused at the gate, struggling with the latch until it gave with a soft, metallic snap. Beyond lay the unplowed service road, stretching into the dark woods. They walked quickly, her boots sinking into the snow, the suitcase's wheels useless on the uneven ground. Max moved ahead, nose down, his body tense but eager. The snow came in gusts now, swirling so thick she could barely see a few feet ahead. The silence was absolute, save for the crunch of their steps and the wind's low howl through the pines. Half a mile down the road, they reached the old maintenance shed that marked the edge of Winchester property. Savannah stopped under its overhang to catch her breath. Her cheeks were numb, her gloved hands stiff. She looked back, but the estate was invisible in the blizzard. It was strange, how quickly a place could vanish once you left it. She thought of Ethan now, perhaps sitting at Grace's bedside, his voice low and warm in a way it had never been for her. The thought made her grip Max's leash tighter. The road ahead curved toward the small town she had only seen from a distance during the rare outings Ethan allowed her. Somewhere beyond those snow-choked streets was a bus station. Somewhere beyond that was the life she had once imagined for herself, without gilded cages, without contracts, without someone holding the keys to her choices. Max leaned into her leg, his eyes steady on hers. She smiled faintly, brushing the snow from his muzzle. "Come on," she said. "We're not stopping now." And so, with the snow erasing their footprints almost as fast as they made them, they stepped out from the shed's shadow and disappeared into the night. The air smelled different in Florida, warm and salt-laced, as if every breeze carried whispers from the ocean. Savannah felt it the moment she stepped off the bus, the sunlight touching her skin without the sharpness of winter. It was mid-March, yet the streets of Clearwater were lined with palm trees swaying gently, their fronds casting lazy shadows across the sidewalks. Max trotted beside her, his golden coat almost glowing in the sun, nose twitching at the new scents: saltwater, grilled seafood, and hibiscus blooms. Her new apartment was modest, a small one-bedroom on the second floor of a pastel-colored building just 3 blocks from the beach. The landlord, Mrs. Janice Holloway, was a woman in her late 60s, plump and cheerful, with a crown of short white curls and a habit of wearing oversized sunglasses even indoors. She had a faint scent of lavender and spoke in a lilting southern accent that made Savannah feel unexpectedly welcome. "You're in the quiet unit," she said, handing over the keys. "No noisy neighbors except the gulls, and they don't pay rent." Savannah smiled politely, glancing around the sunlit room. The furniture was simple but clean, the walls painted a soft cream. She set her suitcase down, unclipped Max's leash, and watched as he wandered the apartment, sniffing every corner before sprawling by the sliding balcony door. 2 days later, she started her new job at Shoreline Marketing, a mid-sized firm housed in a 3-story building painted coral pink with white trim. Her role as an administrative assistant was far from glamorous, but it paid steadily and came with regular hours, a luxury she hadn't known in years. Her supervisor, Mark Davidson, was a man in his early 40s with sandy brown hair and a hint of stubble along his jaw. His hazel eyes had a kindness to them, though his manner was brisk, as if he was constantly trying to stay ahead of a clock only he could hear. Mark had grown up in Clearwater and returned after a divorce, which explained the faint weariness in his smile. Still, he treated Savannah with respect, never prying into her personal life, and she appreciated that. The office itself was a blend of casual chatter and the soft hum of computers. Her desk sat near the window where she could glimpse the Gulf's shimmering waters between the buildings. On her first lunch break, she walked down to the beach, sandals in hand, Max padding happily beside her. The sand was warm underfoot, and the sound of waves was gentler than she'd imagined. more like a lullaby than the roar she remembered from childhood vacations. For weeks, her life settled into a rhythm she hadn't thought possible. Mornings at work, afternoons walking Max along the shoreline, evenings cooking simple dinners in her little kitchen. Max loved the beach, bounding into the shallow surf to chase gulls, then rolling in the sand until his coat was dusted pale. Savannah laughed more in those weeks than she had in years. Gradually, the sharp edges of her memories of Ethan began to blur. She no longer flinched at the thought of his voice or the weight of his disapproval. The cold stone halls of the Winchester estate felt like a place she had read about in a book. Distant, unreal. One Friday evening she sat on the balcony with a glass of iced tea, the sky streaked with pink and gold, Max resting his head on her lap. She idly flipped through channels on her small TV, stopping at a news segment about a high-profile charity gala in New York. The image cut to Ethan Winchester, impeccably dressed in a black tuxedo, standing beside Grace, who wore a shimmering silver gown. They smiled for the cameras, Grace's hand resting lightly on his arm. Savannah froze, the sound of the waves in the distance dimming under the voice of the reporter. Ethan Winchester and Grace Ellington, whose engagement was announced last week. Her breath caught. She hadn't known, hadn't even imagined he would make such a public declaration. For a long moment she stared at the screen, her mind empty of thought, only the thud of her heartbeat in her ears. Max shifted, sensing her change in mood, and nuzzled her hand. She forced a small smile, stroking his head. "It's okay, boy," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. The segment ended and she switched off the TV, the room falling into quiet. Outside, the last light of day slipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to prick the sky. Savannah leaned back in her chair, letting the humid air wrap around her. She told herself that this, her new life, her freedom, her evenings on the balcony with Max, was what mattered now. But somewhere deep inside, she felt the faint echo of a door closing for good. The heat of a Florida afternoon shimmered off the pavement, bending the air in strange waves. Savannah had just returned from the beach with Max, his golden coat damp from chasing the surf, when she saw the unfamiliar car parked outside her apartment building, a sleek pearl-white sedan with tinted windows. The engine idled softly, a faint hum beneath the cries of gulls overhead. She slowed, Max padding beside her, ears pricked. The passenger door opened and Grace Ellington stepped out. She was as poised as ever, dressed in a tailored ivory sheath dress that clung just enough to suggest elegance without effort. A wide-brimmed hat shielded her flawless skin from the sun, and her pale blue eyes locked on Savannah's with unsettling precision. Even in the humid air, she moved like she'd stepped out of a climate-controlled showroom, untouched, impeccable. "Savannah," Grace greeted, her voice smooth but carrying an undertone of urgency. "May we talk?" Savannah's first instinct was to turn around and walk away, but curiosity, and the faintest sting of defiance, kept her rooted. She led Grace up the narrow stairs to her apartment, the two women stepping into the modest space that smelled faintly of salt water and brewed coffee. Max stayed close to Savannah's side, his body taut, gaze fixed on their visitor. Grace's eyes swept the room, lingering a moment too long on the stack of work files on the table and the bowl of dog toys by the balcony door. Finally, she removed her hat, revealing the meticulous sweep of her blonde hair. She reached into her bag and withdrew a slim envelope, placing it on the table between them. "It's a revised contract," Grace said, her manicured nails tapping the paper. "A significantly larger sum than before. All I ask is that you return, for a time, to help Ethan. He's under a great deal of strain. Our engagement is still public, but I'm not ready to marry. You know him, Savannah. You know what he needs." Savannah let out a short, humorless laugh. "You mean help him so you don't have to? That's generous of you." Grace's composure didn't crack, but a shadow flickered in her gaze. "I'm being pragmatic. He's not an easy man. He trusts you in ways he doesn't trust others. And frankly—" She paused, choosing her words. "Frankly, you ground him." Savannah leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "Tell me, Grace, does Ethan know you're here, trying to outsource his needs like some madam arranging appointments for a client?" This time, Grace's jaw tightened, but she didn't rise to the bait. "I came because I think it's in everyone's best interest, especially his." Savannah stood, picking up the envelope and tossing it back onto the table. "No, Grace. My life isn't a service you can buy. Not anymore." Grace stared at her for a long moment, then gathered her hat, her movements clipped. "Think about it," she said softly, though the steel in her tone betrayed the request as anything but gentle. She left without another glance, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. Max huffed and circled back to his place by the balcony, curling up with his back to the door. Savannah stroked his head absently, the weight of the exchange pressing down on her. 2 days later, the phone rang while she was preparing dinner. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was unmistakably refined, each syllable precise. "This is Margaret Winchester," the woman said. "Ethan's mother." Savannah's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you want? I won't waste your time. I understand Grace approached you. I also understand you refused." "That's right," Savannah said flatly. Margaret exhaled, the sound crisp even through the line. "My son is difficult. He has been since his father died. But you've managed something no one else has. He feels when you're around him. You make him react. I've seen it myself. Grace does not." Savannah almost laughed, though it came out sharper than she intended. "So now, you're both here to convince me I'm some kind of emotional support animal for your son?" "This isn't a jest," Margaret replied. "You could make a difference, more than you realize. And why would I want to? I left for a reason." "Because," Margaret said, her voice softening, "no matter what you tell yourself, part of you still cares." Savannah felt her throat tighten, but forced the words out. "Not enough to go back." There was a pause, a faint sigh. Then the line went dead. That night, Savannah stood on the balcony, the ocean breeze warm against her skin, the moon casting a path of silver over the waves. Max lay at her feet, his head on his paws, watching the water. She thought about Grace's perfect smile, Margaret's measured voice, and the way Ethan had once looked at her before everything turned into cold transactions. But she didn't regret her answer. Not now. Not ever. The morning air in Clearwater was warm and damp, the kind that clung to the skin even before the sun had fully risen. Savannah had just stepped out of her apartment building with Max when she saw him, Ethan Winchester, standing by the curb as though he had been carved from the very shadow of the palm trees. He wore a charcoal suit, incongruously formal against the pastel-colored street, his black hair slightly mussed by the sea breeze. The sharp planes of his face were unchanged, though there was a strain around his eyes, faint lines that spoke of sleepless nights. He said her name like it was both a greeting and a confession. "Savannah." She tightened her grip on Max's leash, the dog immediately moving closer to her side. "What are you doing here? I needed to see you." His voice was low, steady, but there was a hesitation in it she had never heard before. "I haven't loved anyone, ever. But if I've ever come close, it was with you." Savannah's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. 4 years, Ethan. 4 years, and you never said it until now." "I was wrong," he said simply, his gaze never leaving hers. "I thought keeping you was enough. That money, safety, control would be enough, but you left, and I—" He broke off, glancing away, jaw tightening. "I've never been the same." The heat shimmered between them. Savannah shifted Max's leash to her other hand. "It's over, Ethan. You can't fix what you spent years breaking." He didn't argue. Not then. But the next day, he was there again, standing outside the glass doors of Shoreline Marketing when she left work, leaning against the hood of a rental car with the stubborn stillness of a man who had decided to wait out a storm. He didn't speak to her in public, only offered a brief nod when she passed, Max barking once before Savannah tugged him along. For the next week he returned every afternoon, as if showing up could turn time backward. Some days he was in a pressed shirt with rolled sleeves, other days in the same suit, jacket slung over one arm, his tie loosened. He never looked disheveled, but there was a fraying to his presence, an exhaustion that wasn't physical but bone-deep. Savannah avoided meeting his gaze, kept her conversations at work light, her evenings filled with long walks by the shore. But no matter how far she walked, she could feel him there, in the periphery of her mind, the way an old injury still aches before a storm. Then one Friday evening, as the tide rolled in under a pink-orange sky, she returned home to find Margaret Winchester seated in the lobby of her building. The older woman was dressed in impeccably, as always, navy linen suit, pearl earrings, silver hair pulled into a smooth chignon. Her posture was perfect, but her hands were clasped a little too tightly in her lap. "Savannah," Margaret said, standing. "May I have a word?" Savannah hesitated, then nodded toward the bench near the window. Max settled at her feet, his golden eyes tracking every movement. "My son is leaving," Margaret began. "He's been advised to spend some time overseas for psychological treatment." He agreed, but not without seeing you first. Her gaze held Savannah's, sharp, yet pleading. "I will ask you plainly, is there truly no chance?" Savannah felt the weight of the question press against her chest. She thought of the winter nights in Maine, the sound of Max's collar in the quiet halls, Ethan's rare moments of unguarded laughter, the way hope had been both a lifeline and a chain. She smiled faintly, but there was no softness in it. "No, Mrs. Winchester, there isn't." The older woman studied her for a long moment, then inclined her head in something between acceptance and resignation. "Then I wish you well," she said quietly. 2 days later, the train station was alive with the sound of departing journeys, brakes screeching, engines humming, conductors calling destinations. Savannah stood on the platform in a light sundress, her hair swept back by the coastal wind. Max sat obediently beside her, tail curling around his paws, the silver tag on his collar catching the morning light. The announcement for her train echoed through the station. She glanced down the platform and for a fleeting second thought she saw a tall figure in a dark coat watching from the crowd. But when she looked again, the space was empty. She stepped onto the train, Max trotting at her side. As the doors slid shut, she took a window seat, watching the platform recede. The past 4 years unraveled behind her. Contracts and cold halls, whispered apologies and unanswered questions, until all that remained was the steady rhythm of the rails and the warmth of the dog leaning against her leg. Savannah closed her eyes, breathing in the freedom she had fought for, the life that was finally hers. And as the train carried her away, the story she had lived with Ethan Winchester ended, not with anger, but with a quiet, irrevocable goodbye. Life doesn't always give us what we ask for, but God is always placing quiet miracles along our path. Sometimes that miracle is a closed door that makes way for a new journey, and sometimes it's a heart strong enough to let go of the past. Savannah found her freedom not through a perfect ending, but through the strength God gave her, and the faithful love of Max. In our everyday lives, the same is true. Even in loss and hardship, God is at work, arranging something good for the days ahead. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to this channel so we can keep sharing stories that warm the soul. May God bless you and your family, and may you always find hope and peace in every season of your life.